In the dim glow of twilight, the streets of Everwood City whispered of forgotten tales and unspoken warnings. As the shadows lengthened, an unassuming figure maneuvered a moped through the serpentine alleys. Jake, a food delivery rider with his weather jacket zipped up to his chin, clutched his delivery bag like a lifeline. He was new to the job but eager to prove himself, even if it meant taking the last, often unwanted, delivery shift. The order was straightforward: deliver a meal to 1437 Hollowgate Road. The address seemed familiar, as though it whispered a memory he couldn't quite place. As Jake approached the street, a dense fog rolled in, damp and chilling to the bone. Hollowgate Road was at the outskirts, where the city's vibrant life faded into desolate, quiet houses that spoke of better days long past. 1437 Hollowgate stood apart from its neighbours, a dilapidated mansion that gnawed on the remnants of its former grandeur. Its windows, clouded with the dust of decades, failed to reflect the moonlight. As Jake killed the engine of his moped, the silence seemed to swallow the sound whole. He grabbed the food, his breath visible in the cold air, and approached the ominous house. Knocking on the aged wood of the door, he heard the echo travel deeper into the house than any ordinary home. There was no answer, but the door creaked open under his tentative push, revealing a pitch-dark foyer. "Hello." His voice was met with silence. Jake stepped inside, rationalizing that leaving the food at the door wouldn't fulfill his duty. As he advanced, the door slammed shut behind him, extinguished the little light he had, and enveloped him in darkness. With his phone's flashlight piercing the darkness, Jake navigated through a hallway choked with cobwebs and dust. Portraits on the walls peered down at him, eyes seemingly following his every move. The air was thick, filled with the smell of mold and something faintly metallic. He shivered, not solely from the cold. Reaching what seemed to be the kitchen, Jake set the food down on a table clouded with dust. Just as he turned to leave, a soft thump came from the upper floor. Freezing, he listened as another followed, then another, each growing louder and closer. The primal part of his brain screamed to flee, but his feet rooted to the spot. Then, a voice, raspy and dry as if from unused vocal cords, called out, "Thank you." The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, and with it, the house groaned as if settling deeper into its foundations. Jake's heart raced as he backed towards the door he had entered through, only to find it locked. Panic clawed at his chest as he turned to face the dark heart of the house. That's when he noticed it. The pictures on the wall weren't just paintings, they were portraits of delivery riders, each with a plaque stating a date. The dates were all the same, and they were all today's date. His phone's light flickered as he heard a whisper behind him, "Stay with us." Turning around swiftly, he found nothing but the oppressive darkness of the room. The whisper turned into a chuckle, then into an uproar of laughter echoing through the hallways. The house shook violently, dust and plaster raining down. In a desperate attempt, Jake threw himself against the door repeatedly. It wouldn't budge. He was about to scream when he saw it, a small window in the kitchen, perhaps just large enough to escape through. As he moved towards it, the laughter grew louder, more frenzied. The floor beneath him trembled as he reached the window, unlatching it with trembling hands. Climbing through, he felt hands, no, claws, graze his ankle. With a yelp, he tumbled out onto the overgrown lawn, scrambling to his feet and not looking back as he ran towards his moped. The engine roared to life on the first kick, and as he sped away, he dared a glance back. Their house was dark, silent, as if nothing had happened. But as Jake rode back to the brighter streets of Everwood City, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed him out of that house. Something that lingered just at the edge of his vision, whispering promises of return. And tonight, as he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the shadows in his room seemed to creep closer, whispering, "Soon." As Jake lay in his bed that night, his mind raced with the haunting memories of 1437 Hollowgate Road. The shadows in his room seemed to dance and shift with a life of their own, each movement accompanied by a soft whisper that echoed the promise, soon. Despite the warmth of his bed, a cold dread settled over him, seeping into his bones. Over the next few days, Jake tried to resume his normal routine, but the shadow of Hollowgate clung to him like a second skin. At work, his deliveries were punctual, yet he found himself constantly looking over his shoulder, jumping at the slightest sound. His co-workers noticed his pale complexion and jumpy demeanor but chalked it up to stress or lack of sleep. However, the real horror began one evening as Jake was closing up the shop. As he turned off the lights and locked the front door, he felt a chilling breeze brush against his neck, whispering, "Why did you leave us, Jake?" Spinning around, he found only the empty, dimly lit street. Rushing home, Jake bolted his door and checked every lock twice. The safety of his apartment brought little comfort. The walls seemed to pulsate with a quiet malevolence, and the faint laughter from that night at Hollowgate seemed to echo through the vents. That night, as he tried to sleep, the whispers grew louder. They were no longer content to linger in the shadows, they seemed to emanate from right beside him. "Join us, Jake," they cooed, their voices a symphony of desperation and menace. He pulled the covers over his head, trying to block out the sounds, but it was futile. The whispers penetrated every defense, seeping into his very thoughts. The following morning, Jake found his apartment inexplicably cold. Frost patterned the windows, and his breath came out in visible puffs. Confused and scared, he decided to seek help. He contacted a local paranormal expert, Dr. Helena Markham, known for her extensive research into the supernatural. Dr. Markham was a woman in her late 50s, with streaks of silver in her hair and a presence that commanded respect. She listened intently as Jake recounted his experiences, her eyes sharp and calculating. "This sounds like a classic haunting, but intensified by your direct interaction with the source," she explained, her voice steady and reassuring. 1437 Hollowgate has a history, one steeped in tragedy and unresolved spirits. When you entered, you might have disrupted a spiritual boundary. "What can I do?" Jake asked, desperation creeping into his voice. "We need to confront this at its source." "You must go back to Hollowgate," Dr. Markham declared. The mere thought made Jake's stomach churn, but he knew he had no other choice. Arrangements were made, and 2 nights later, he found himself once again standing before the ominous facade of 1437 Hollowgate, this time accompanied by Dr. Markham and her assistant, carrying an array of equipment ranging from EMF meters to holy water. As they stepped inside, the air turned frigid, and the familiar smell of decay filled their nostrils. Dr. Markham began chanting in a low, rhythmic tone, her words foreign and ancient. Jake held a camera, recording everything, while her assistant monitored the equipment. They made their way to the kitchen, the site of Jake's last encounter. The table where he had left the food was now covered in a thick layer of dust, as if years had passed since his last visit. The portraits on the wall stared down at them, their eyes seeming to follow every movement. As Dr. Markham's chanting grew louder, the temperature dropped further, their breaths creating fog in the air. Then, the laughter started, low and menacing, rising in volume until it was nearly deafening. Shadows twisted and turned around them, forming shapes that were almost human. "Stay close," Dr. Markham shouted over the din, her voice calm despite the chaos. "We must find the heart of the house. That's where the energy is strongest." They moved as a unit, heading towards the staircase that led to the upper floors. With each step, the house seemed to resist, the stairs creaking ominously under their weight, the walls bleeding shadows like ink in water. As they reached the top of the stairs, they were met with a long hallway. Doors lined each side, but at the end, one door stood ajar, a faint light spilling out. That's when they heard it, a child's cry, soft and mournful, coming from the room with the light. With a collective breath, they approached the door, pushing it open. Inside, the room was surprisingly warm, decorated like a child's nursery. Toys were scattered about, and in the center, a crib stood with a rocking horse beside it. The crying had stopped, replaced now by a soft lullaby that seemed to emanate from an unseen source. The melody was hypnotic, weaving through the air with an eerie grace that belied its sinister origin. Dr. Markham's eyes narrowed as she surveyed the room, her hand moving to clutch a small, silver crucifix hanging from her neck. "This is no ordinary haunting," she murmured, more to herself than to Jake or her assistant. "There's a deep sorrow here, entwined with malevolent intent." The lullaby grew louder, the notes distorting into a cacophony of discordant sounds that seemed to claw at the very air. The toys in the room began to move of their own accord, a teddy bear's head turning slowly towards them, its glassy eyes gleaming in the dim light. A train set whirred to life, its cheerful chugging a stark contrast to the thick, oppressive atmosphere of the room. Jake felt a chill run down his spine as he watched the scene unfold, his hands trembling slightly as he continued to record. Dr. Markham began to chant again, her voice clear and authoritative, cutting through the noise of the lullaby and the mechanical laughter of the toys. Her assistant, a stout man named Edgar, sprinkled holy water around the room, each drop sizzling as it hit the surfaces, emitting a faint white smoke. The room seemed to react, the walls pulsing as if they were breathing, the shadows swirling faster. Suddenly, the crib began to rock violently, back and forth, with no visible hand guiding it. From the depths of the shadows behind it, a figure began to materialize, a woman, her features gaunt, her eyes hollow pits of despair. She wore a faded Victorian gown, and her hair was wild and unkempt. Her lips moved, but no sound came out at first. Then, as if finding strength, her voice echoed through the room, shrill and desperate. "Return him to me. Return my son," she screamed, her voice distorting as if dragged across broken glass. Dr. Markham stepped forward, her crucifix held out before her. "We mean you no harm. We are here to help you find peace," she said firmly, her voice imbued with a calm authority that contrasted sharply with the chaos of the room. The spectral figure halted its advance, tilting its head as if considering her words. The room grew silent, the lullaby fading into a soft, mournful wind that seemed to whisper through the cracks and crevices of the old house. "Why do you linger here in sorrow?" Dr. Markham continued, her tone gentle yet unwavering. The ghost's form flickered like a candle flame caught in a draught. "They took him from me, my boy, my life," she wailed, the pain evident in her ethereal voice. "We will help you," Dr. Markham promised, stepping closer to the apparition. "But you must cease these hauntings. You must let go of this world and move on to the next, where peace awaits you and your son." The figure seemed to ponder this, her form stabilizing slightly. The oppressive atmosphere in the room began to lift, the air growing lighter, as if a weight had been removed from the very essence of the space. But then, the peace was shattered by a loud crash downstairs, the sound of breaking glass and splintering wood. Jake, Dr. Markham, and Edgar exchanged alarmed glances. "We must check that," Edgar said, his voice tight with concern. Leaving the nursery and the spectral mother momentarily, they hurried downstairs, their steps heavy on the creaking staircase. As they reached the bottom, they were met with a scene of chaos. The front door had been blown off its hinges, lying splintered across the entrance hall. The air was cold, colder than before, a biting chill that seemed unnatural. From the shadows of the hall, a new form emerged, larger and far more menacing than the grieving mother. Its eyes glowed red in the dim light, and its presence filled the space with a malevolent force that seemed to suck the warmth from the air. "We are not done here," it growled, its voice a deep rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. "This house is mine." Dr. Markham raised her crucifix again, facing the new threat with a resolute expression. "We will not be deterred," she declared. "This place will be cleansed." The entity laughed, a sound like thunder rolling across the hills. "Try and suffer." The standoff was palpable, the tension like a tightrope stretched to its limit. Jake felt every muscle in his body tense, ready for what was to come. They were in the heart of the haunting now, facing a force that had claimed Hollowgate as its own. And somewhere, in the back of his mind, Jake knew that the story of Hollowgate was far from over. The true battle was just beginning. As the entity's laughter echoed through the halls of Hollowgate, Dr. Markham took a step forward, her faith unwavering. "In the name of the light, I command you to leave this place," she intoned, her voice strong and resonant in the oppressive gloom. The entity's response was swift and terrifying. With a motion too quick to see, it sent a wave of dark energy crashing towards them. Dr. Markham raised her crucifix, and the energy dissipated inches from her, but the force knocked her back. Edgar caught her, steadying her on her feet, but the fear in his eyes was palpable. Jake, meanwhile, continued to film everything, despite his hands shaking. The camera captured the swirling darkness, the glowing red eyes of the entity, and the steadfast resolve of Dr. Markham and Edgar. This was no longer just a delivery gone wrong, it was a battle for souls, played out in the shadows of an accursed mansion. The entity advanced, the floorboards groaning under its unseen weight. "This house belongs to me. It feeds me," it growled, its voice a mix of gravel and malice. "Leave or be consumed." Dr. Markham, recovering her stance, began to chant in Latin, her words slicing through the air like a beacon of light. Edgar joined in, his voice less certain but growing stronger with each word. The entity recoiled as if struck, its form flickering like a disturbed shadow. But it was not defeated. With a roar that shook the very foundations of the house, it surged forward, its form expanding, enveloping the room in darkness. The temperature dropped sharply, breath turning to mist, as the darkness sought to overwhelm them. In that moment of near despair, a soft, melodic voice rose above the din, a lullaby, pure and clear. It was the ghostly mother from the nursery, her figure appearing at the top of the stairs, glowing faintly in the gloom. Her presence brought a sudden warmth to the chilling air, and the darkness hesitated, confused by the purity of her song. "Leave this place," she sang, her voice gaining strength. "Leave and find peace." The entity roared in defiance, but its form began to waver, the edges of its darkness fraying. Dr. Markham seized the moment, her chants growing louder, more commanding. Edgar, inspired, lifted his voice alongside hers, their words a dual force of faith and determination. Their house trembled, objects levitating briefly before crashing to the ground. The entity, now visibly struggling, lashed out wildly, dark tendrils whipping through the air. Jake ducked as one such tendril smashed a vase near his head, sending shards flying. As the battle intensified, the spectral mother descended the stairs, her form becoming more solid with each step. Reaching the bottom, she stood before the entity, her presence radiant and serene. "I forgive you," she whispered, her words simple yet profound. With those words, a shockwave of energy burst forth, radiance meeting darkness in a collision of wills. The entity shrieked, its form contorting in agony, as light began to pierce its body, illuminating the hollows of its eyes, the depth of its despair. Jake watched, awestruck, as the entity's form diminished, shrinking under the weight of the spectral mother's forgiveness and the relentless chants of Dr. Markham and Edgar. It let out one final, pitiful wail before dissolving completely, leaving behind only a whisper of cold air. The immediate threat gone, the house seemed to sigh, a sound of release and relief. The darkness receded, and for the first time, the air felt clean, unburdened by the presence of malevolence. But as they gathered their breaths, reveling in the momentary peace, an unsettling realization dawned on Jake. The entity had claimed the house fed it, suggesting that Hollowgate might not be the only such source of dark energy. There could be others, each with its own horrors, waiting in the shadows of forgotten places. Dr. Markham seemed to sense his thoughts. "Our work is not done," she said, looking around the now quiet house. "There are more battles to be fought, more souls to be freed." As they left Hollowgate, the first light of dawn tinted the sky with hues of orange and purple. The house, for the first time in decades, stood silent and still, a relic of the past slowly embracing a new beginning. Yet, as they drove away, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a much larger story, a story of darkness and light, of battles yet to be fought, and of the relentless pursuit of peace for tormented souls. And somewhere, in the back of his mind, Jake knew that the road ahead would be fraught with peril, each turn bringing new challenges and darker realms to explore. As they journeyed back into the heart of the city, the early morning light seemed to wash away the terrors of the night, but Jake's mind was heavy with the weight of what they had encountered. He thought about the ghostly mother who had found her peace, and wondered about the countless others who might still be suffering, trapped in an eternal loop of their darkest moments. The entity might have been vanquished, but the energy it spoke of, that sinister nourishment it drew from the house, lingered in his thoughts. What was it? How many other places like Hollowgate were out there? Dr. Markham, sensing his unease, placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. You did well, Jake. But remember, this is just the beginning. These forces, these spirits, they are more common than you might think. Each one has a story, a reason for their pain. Our job is to understand and, if possible, to help them. The sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the city streets as they returned to Dr. Markham's office. The place was lined with books on paranormal research, artifacts from various cases, and maps dotted with notes and markers. We need to prepare for more, Dr. Markham announced as she gestured towards the maps. Hollowgate was not an isolated incident. I've been tracking reports, patterns of disturbances that suggest we're dealing with a much larger network of dark energy. Jake leaned closer, observing the clusters of markers, each representing different incidents, hauntings, spectral sightings, unusual energy disturbances. The pattern was unsettlingly widespread, covering not just their city but extending far beyond. Each of these points could be another Hollowgate, another hotspot for supernatural activity, Dr. Markham explained. We've been reactive for too long, dealing with spirits as they come. It's time we become proactive, to seek these places out and cleanse them before more harm is done. But how do we even start? How do we find them? Jake asked, feeling overwhelmed by the scale of their task. We'll start with research and reconnaissance. We'll need to gather more data, interview witnesses, and survey these areas. You learn, Jake. I'll train you in detecting spiritual disturbances, in understanding the signs. As they discussed their strategy, Edgar set up multiple screens, each showing different locations, live feeds from cameras they had installed in known paranormal hotspots. The screens flickered with the occasional shadow or unexplained light anomaly. This is our command center, Edgar explained. We monitor these sites 24/7. Any unusual activity, and we investigate. Jake watched, fascinated but also apprehensive. The reality of his new role was sinking in. He was no longer just a delivery driver, he had stepped into a world that few knew existed, a world that skirted the edges of the known and dipped into the shadows of the unknown. As the day progressed, they equipped themselves with various tools, EMF meters, digital recorders, thermal cameras, and, of course, holy items for protection. Dr. Markham also handed Jake a small journal. Record everything, she instructed. Every detail can be crucial. That night, their first call came. A woman reported seeing apparitions in her child's bedroom, her distress palpable over the phone. As they approached her house, the familiar sense of dread settled over Jake, but this time, he felt a resolve too. He was part of something important, something that could make a real difference. They entered the home, and the air was thick with the electric tension of unseen eyes watching. The child's room was cold, colder than the rest of the house, and the toys seemed to be arranged in a peculiar pattern, almost ritualistic. Dr. Markham began her assessment, speaking softly to the mother, who clutched her robe tightly around her, her eyes darting around the room. "When did you first notice the apparitions?" she asked. "About a week ago," the woman replied, her voice trembling. "It started with noises, like whispers. I thought it was just the house settling. But then I saw it, a shadow, by his crib. My baby, he's been so restless." As they prepared to cleanse the room, Jake felt the temperature drop further, a sign that the spirit was aware of their presence. He readied his camera, his hand steadier now, his mind focused. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices that seemed both curious and hostile. The room blurred around the edges, the atmosphere thickening. Dr. Markham started her incantations, her voice a beacon in the creeping darkness. Jake knew this was another step in their journey, a journey that promised no end, only deeper descents into realms fraught with peril and shadows eager to envelop the unwary. And as they stood there, confronting the unknown, Jake realized this was his new reality, a life forever intertwined with the spectral and the unseen. The room seemed to pulse with a life of its own as Dr. Markham's voice filled the space, her words clear and powerful. The shadows writhed in the corners, as if agitated by her presence. As the incantation reached its climax, a visible shudder passed through the room. The temperature slowly began to rise back to normal, and the oppressive atmosphere started to dissipate. The woman clutched her robe closer, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and relief. The child, previously restless in his crib, now lay quiet, his little chest rising and falling in the serene sleep of the innocent. They had done it again, they had cleansed another haunt, eased another spectral suffering. As they packed up their tools, the mother thanked them profusely, her voice choked with emotion. "I don't know how to thank you enough," she whispered, holding her child close. Dr. Markham smiled, a gentle, reassuring smile. "Just take care of yourself and your son. Remember, peace is now with you." As they stepped out into the cool night air, the city around them felt different to Jake. Every shadow seemed to hold a story, every whisper of the wind a secret. The night was no longer just a veil for rest, it was a canvas of hidden depths, waiting to be explored and understood. In the van, as they drove back to the office, Jake reflected on his journey from a simple delivery driver to a seeker of truths hidden in the shadows. The road ahead was long and uncertain, fraught with challenges and dangers, but also filled with potential for redemption and peace. Dr. Markham caught his thoughtful look in the rearview mirror. "What's on your mind, Jake?" she asked, her voice tinged with curiosity. "Just thinking about how much there is that we don't see, how many stories are hidden just out of sight," Jake replied, his gaze fixed on the passing lights. "That's the nature of our world," Dr. Markham said, nodding. "Most walk through life unaware of the layers beneath. But now you see, and seeing changes everything." "Yes, it does," Jake agreed, feeling a newfound respect for the delicate balance between the seen and the unseen, the known and the unknown. As they arrived back at the command center, the screens continued to flicker with scenes from other parts of the city, other potential hauntings, other souls in need. The night was far from over, and their work was never truly done. Jake stepped out of the van, taking a deep breath of the cool night air. He looked up at the stars, a tapestry of light against the dark sky, and felt a connection to something greater, something infinite. The journey into the night continued, each case a thread in the larger weave of his new existence. And as he walked back into the building, ready to face whatever the next call might bring, he knew this was just the beginning. The mystery and the mission of their work were far-reaching, and the story of their encounters with the spectral realm was far from over. The night held many more tales, and Jake was ready to discover them, one shadow at a time. As the days melded into weeks, and the weeks into months, Jake's life became a mosaic of spectral confrontations and whispered secrets from beyond. With each case, he grew more adept, his initial fear giving way to a resolute determination. But no amount of experience could have prepared him for the call that came on a wind-whipped night in late October, a call that would forever change the course of his journey. The address was old, even by Everwood City's standards, nestled on the forgotten edge of town where the fog hung thick like a shroud. The house, known simply as the Crooked Man's, was infamous, its history marred by tragedy and unexplained disappearances. As they approached, the silhouette of the manse loomed through the mist, its windows dark eyes staring into the soul. Dr. Markham sensed Jake's apprehension, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Remember, fear is a natural response, but do not let it rule you. We're here to help, to bring peace. The front door creaked open at their touch, revealing a grand foyer shrouded in dust and silence. They set up their equipment in the center of the room, the air thick with the anticipation of the unknown. As they began their cleansing ritual, the house seemed to awaken, groaning under the weight of its own history. Suddenly, a cold gust swept through the manse, extinguishing their candles and plunging them into darkness. From the shadows, a voice, twisted and spiteful, hissed, "Leave this place." Jake steadied his breath, his hand instinctively reaching for the crucifix around his neck. "We mean no harm. We are here to help you find peace," he called into the darkness, echoing Dr. Markham's earlier words. The air grew colder, the darkness denser, as if absorbing all light, all warmth. Then, the entity revealed itself, a twisted figure, its form blurred and shifting, eyes glowing with a malevolent red light. It moved towards them with unnatural speed, its voice a cacophony of screams and whispers. Dr. Markham began chanting louder, her words a beacon in the consuming dark. Jake joined in, his voice firm, driving back the fear that clawed at his mind. The entity halted, its form flickering under the power of their combined wills. "This is your last chance to find peace," Dr. Markham shouted over the howling wind that filled the manse. "Let go of your pain." With a defiant screech that shook the very foundations of the house, the entity exploded into a blinding light, and then, just as quickly, it was gone. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, the air filling with a palpable sense of relief. As the first rays of dawn broke through the windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, Jake and Dr. Markham stood in silence, processing the night's events. They had faced one of the strongest entities yet, and they had prevailed. "We did it," Jake said, a small smile breaking through his exhaustion. "We did," Dr. Markham agreed. "But remember, our journey doesn't end here. There will be others who need our help." As they packed up their equipment, Jake felt a change within himself. He was no longer the man who had timidly entered Hollowgate months ago. He was a guardian, a protector of the living and the dead. He knew now that the world was filled with shadows, but where there was darkness, there was also light. And as long as there were those who dwelled in the shadows, he would be there, a beacon in the dark, guiding them home. The sun rose higher, casting golden beams across the worn floorboards of the Crooked Man's. Jake took one last look at the house, now silent and at peace, and stepped out into the new day, ready for whatever mysteries lay ahead. His journey was far from over, but for now, he had found his calling among the whispers and the wraiths. And that was enough.